Let me just start off by asking, the UN Security Council is holding an emergency session to address the escalating violence in Syria. What do you think is the likely outcome of these sessions, and what are the expectations for what may happen in the next, few days or months?
Well, it's important to note that this Security Council session comes upon the request of Syria. The Security Council non-permanent member states of Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and Algeria have submitted a request of the UN Security Council to convene in order to an emergency session, of course, in order to discuss the developments in Syria upon the request of the Syrian government, which means that the permanent members or the members of themselves of the Security Council did not move on their own will to or volition in order to convene this meeting. So this is very important to note. And the UN Security Council, of course, is the competent authority to discuss the ongoing developments in Syria, as the situation over there is extremely dangerous. This is an internal conflict with regional and international dimensions. And all the belligerents, the different belligerents of this conflict are supported by major regional and international powers. So this has the potential of spilling over into neighboring Iraq or even into neighboring Syria, and even affecting Lebanon, that was just contending with its own war against Israel less than a week ago. So you can imagine how Syria is a powder keg that can set the Middle East on fire, and that's not an exaggeration. So of course the Security Council is convening in order to discuss the situation. However, I do not have any expectations or any decisive resolutions that I would see coming out of the Security Council that can affect the conflict in any meaningful way.
Okay, so you talked about the idea, of it being quite a tense situation, and it's a powder keg and all of that, and that it's very serious. But the United States, France, and Germany, as well as the UK, have called for de-escalation and protecting civilians in Syria. Do you believe that these calls to action will result in any sort of change on the ground, or are they just simply diplomatic gestures? As you said, you're not really expecting much from this emergency meeting.
I don't really believe that these statements, especially on part of the United States, are even sincere, because when you see the discourse, the public discourse of the U.S. administration regarding Syria, you see one thing, that Biden administration saying that we did not know, we had no knowledge of this happening, and we are urging de-escalation in Syria. But at the same time, today, a few hours ago, the U.S. Air Force in Syria was supporting a rebel attack on towns in Deir ez-Zor and positions that are controlled by the Syrian military. So the positions of the Syrian military and other supportive armed factions that support the Syrian military were targeted by U.S. airstrikes in support for rebel groups in Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria. So I do not see how the United States is urging de-escalation while it is actively participating in escalating the conflict in Syria, unfortunately. As for France and Germany, they do not really have any influence or clout on the ground in Syria that they can exercise in order to influence the flow of events, unfortunately. So I do not see these these demands or imploring of calm and de-escalation as sincere to begin with, let alone them being effective on the ground.
Okay, sir, could we talk a bit about what's happening in Syria now on the ground itself? You spoke about how it's a powder keg, and some people, or the Americans, have said that they're surprised by what happened, and yet they're part of it. Do you think that in general, what's happening in Syria is somewhat related to the general instability within the region?
Of course, nothing happens in a vacuum. No event transpires in a vacuum, especially in the Middle East. So, of course, I think it's very interconnected to what's going on in the Middle East, especially with the conflict that has been going on in Lebanon, and even the ceasefire over there is very fragile, and also the conflict in Gaza. So, as I said before in a previous interview, the 7th of October was a watershed moment in the Middle East, and it ignited or basically reignited many dormant conflicts, including the Syrian conflict recently. And of course, even though we cannot say that Israel is directly involved in what's going on, however, we do have evidence, according to former Israeli officials, including a former head of Mossad that Israel provided at many points armed support to armed factions and even terrorist organizations inside Syria, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or the former Jabhat al-Nusra, an affiliate of Al-Qaeda and an international terrorist organization, according to the United Nations, in most of the countries of the world. So they were supported by Israel at some point of time. And how these attacks right now in Syria and how this entire offensive started shortly after the ceasefire was enforced in Lebanon, and how they are serving to sever or attempting to sever the land bridge between Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So I cannot help but think or believe that this is somehow conveniently serving Israel's interests in its conflict by proxy against Iran. So, of course, it is affected by the regional developments, and it will affect further the regional developments, and it might even lead to more dangerous escalations in the region between Iran and Israel, especially that today there was an Israeli airstrike on Damascus today. Reportedly, it was the target of the assassination was a Hezbollah official in Damascus. So I cannot help but think that Israeli periodic or incessant airstrikes against Syria are or did help in a way in paving the way for this onslaught by the armed factions and the armed groups in Idlib, in the north west of the country.